Just to introduce this session, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that there's been enormous growth in grant making, both at the affiliate level and with ACF. And as part of that growth, many of you, and it's been growth in the amount of giving that you've given, the amount of community opportunities for leadership. And so it's been enormous across the state. And as a result of that, a number of you have mentioned that you would really be interested in exploring opportunities and challenges that have arisen as that growth has happened. So you can continue to, both at ACF and at the affiliate level, we can all collectively continue to improve and grow our grant making strategies and best practices in grant making. So we're incredibly fortunate today to have three of Alaska's leading philanthropic leaders, which is repetitive, but maybe I need to go to messaging for impact. And we're just so appreciative they're here today. But before I ask them to briefly introduce themselves, I wanted to just lay out kind of how we thought the hour would go so that you guys know what to expect. We really want it to be a roundtable discussion. We really want it to be an opportunity for you all to explore the questions with these leaders and given their lessons they've learned and their perspectives on grant making. So we'll do a roundtable discussion where I will ask each one of them a series of 4 questions, but during that time, feel free to put your hand up and we'll recognize you if you'd like to jump into the conversation. There's no problem with that. And we also want to block off at the end some time for you to raise what you have seen in your own communities, any opportunities around grant making or challenges that you faced. So it really is an exchange of ideas and conversation. So if that sounds like a good plan to you guys, I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves before I kick off the roundtable questions. Alex, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really nice to be back as part of the convening. When I first started at Rasmussen, which is about a little over 5 years ago, I actually was at, I think, some of the really early convenings. So some of you, your faces are familiar, some are extremely familiar, and some are new. So I really look forward to hearing from you, particularly people I haven't, and be free to answer any questions, or ask any questions. I was born and raised in Anchorage. And my family, my father's from South Carolina, he's African-American, my mother's from Korea. They met in the, kind of the aftermath of the Korean War, and we're one of those families that ended up here because of the military. But my heart's always been in Alaska, although I actually spent about 25 years outside of Alaska, working for a big foundation out of Seattle. I went on the Rasmussen Grantmaker tour as part of the other foundation. I thought, why aren't I here? There are just so many exciting things happening, lots of people collaborating. No offense to the males, but it was incredible like how many female leaders there were. And it was such a difference from when I was growing up. So it just felt like there's this renaissance going on here. And I'm happy to be back and be a part of it. Really excited about the affiliate program. Really amazing how much it's grown. And we have a really close relationship with ACF in many ways. So it's always just a pleasure. So anyway, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Alex. Matt, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Carl. I work for Sea Alaska. I'm the Senior Director of Corporate Communications, and part of that includes overseeing our philanthropy program. Born and raised here in Alaska. I grew up down in Heidelberg, which is on Prince of Wales Island. So lifelong Alaskan, went to UAF and have lived in Anchorage for the better part of the past 20 years. My experience in this space obviously includes my role right now, but it kind of dates back to 15 years I spent at Alyeska Pipeline and a handful of years that I spent over at BP. And so obviously, if you're in the philanthropy world, you know that the Alyeska and BP were two of the leaders. Well, Alyeska still is, and BP was one of the leaders. And so looking forward to the conversation. I don't think you could ever know enough about philanthropy and grant making and how to make an impact. And so it's something that when I was asked to participate today, I was looking forward to sharing my thoughts, but also learning from you guys. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and thank the team, Eleanor, Nina, Mariko, for setting this up. It's really cool to have so many people in this that care. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And last but not least, Megan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Cassiola, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Alaska Humanities Forum. I guess I'll start by just sharing what an honor it was to be invited to be part of the panel with Alex and with Matt, and to get to meet all of you affiliates across the entire state. I was really excited to receive the invitation, and I echo Matt's appreciation for Mariko and Carmen and Eleanor and Nina inviting me to this panel. I have been in the grant making world for 8 years, basically. I'm a few weeks away from 8 years, and I have the whole time I started in it through the Alaska Humanities Forum. And as soon as I got involved in grant making, I really just fell in love. I don't know what better work there is than connecting people to the means to fulfill their biggest dreams, right? And so it's just really powerful, exciting work. I have both led grant making at the forum and learned a lot about grant making in other organizations by sitting on grant panels, grant selection panels, and just connecting with other grant makers around the country and in the state. So excited to now meet with all of you.
Thanks, Megan. So that's great. Thank you for your introductions. I'll just dive in with the first question. And again, I'm going to just let each one of them answer, but anyone from the affiliate community can certainly add in once we get through the first community interchange. We welcome your input and ideas. Maybe I'll start with you, Matt, on this first one. What do you consider best practices in transparent and equitable grant making?
That's a really good question. For me, the transparency comes down to having really crystal clear criteria. And if you understand what your criteria is, what your objectives are, I think then it makes it really easy when you're sitting in the seat of evaluating proposals that come in and being able to match up the proposal to what your actual giving goals are. So to me, it comes down to the criteria. And we spent a lot of time, we actually, with the help of Alex and a few people at ACF, Alaska went through I think a really transformational exercise a few years ago when I joined, where we really looked at, was our grant making really intentional? And the question, and answering that question, it was no at the time, but I think we've gradually been able to improve our criteria, really look at it through the lens of what we're trying to accomplish, which for us, it's impact on our shareholders. And so I really fall back to the criteria and having really clear goals.
Alex, would you add perspective to that question? Different perspective?
Yeah,
or
I think Matt's, exactly right about the clear criteria. I don't know how much help I actually was for Matt. I think he had a pretty good vision of what he wanted to do when he presented it. But it's been pretty exciting to see what you guys are doing. I think one of the things, so I've worked about 20 years in philanthropy in my career and at different places. And I have to say, in some ways it's challenging for Rasmussen Foundation because our mission is so broad. It's literally to make life better for Alaskans. And so, what does that mean? It's hard to have really set targets in that because it's everything. But what I have appreciated being at Rasmussen is the openness with grantees and the communication and, really having you call us. There's always a danger in terms, so basically, you can call us and say, why didn't I get the grant? Or what do you think of our grant? Or, what happened there? And we will say, what happened and hopefully work with you before there's a no. You don't just submit something and there's a no. You submit and then we call and we talk about it. It's like, maybe it should be like this. We really pride ourselves on anything that's presented to the board or that we recommend for a Tier 1 award. It's over 90% approval, maybe 95. And we work really hard to get there. And so that's helpful in terms of equity. There are still challenges because people may not feel they have the access, or it might not feel like they're welcome to contact us. So there are people that are just more comfortable. And that's going to reflect comfort in any power system, right? So the people that are more comfortable in that system are going to be the ones that are perfectly free to say, hey, why didn't I get this grant? Or someone else might be discouraged and say, I don't know what I'm doing. So that's something we're working on. We have, and this is, it actually sounds really artificial, but we have something on the website, our new website that we're going to launch, where it's like, just ask a question. You can actually schedule time directly with program staff, so you can count on it. Even though it's, mechanical, you don't even have to talk to anyone at that point. You can kind of say what it is you need. You can see our schedule. You can schedule time, and we're hoping that'll encourage more people. We also try to go out to the regions and talk and do presentations and try to be in relationship with people. But it's always a challenge. I think, I think we review our grants to try to figure out geographically, where are we? Is that off in terms of, what our population is? It's more difficult when you look at what communities are being served. We know we have a really great track record with Alaska Native organizations, but they're a little more obvious, because of the purpose is usually clearly stated. In rural communities, it's obvious, but then with other populations, it's more difficult. We don't have a way, and we don't currently ask, what is the demographic of your board? What is the demographic of your staff? What's the demographic of who you serve? I think that's probably the direction we'll go, but we're not there yet. And I think that's something, we need to work on, because we don't have a really great way to check our track record.
Helpful. Megan, do you have additional thoughts on this question?
Yeah, Alex and Matt gave such good points around the criteria, the rubric for selection. I think it can be really scary to be transparent about your selection criteria, in part because it feels like it's opening yourself up to direct challenge, and in many ways it is. And so I think that that's the fear that keeps us from doing it. At the same time, those conversations are so powerful, and it is possible to navigate through them when people are challenging your criteria, and you learn so much through those conversations. You sometimes improve your criteria, improve the way that you're articulating them. Sometimes you are challenged about whether you've selected the right priorities. And other times, those conversations help you to feel just really confident in what you have selected. But there's no doubt that they are intimidating to face. And so I just encourage all of you to sort of support one another in those conversations. The other thing that I loved that Alex brought up is this idea of actually trying to get to a really high selection rate. So in other spaces in our life, it's really powerful and exciting to be part of like highly competitive selection pools where you are one of the top 5% that are selected. In grant making, I think that can be a challenge for equity, because people put a lot of time and energy into the application process. And so when you have lots of people in your community investing lots of time and effort up front and then not receiving any funding, that's a drain to the community rather than a bonus. And so we really want to be careful about that tension between being appropriately selective and trying to be open to a wide range of projects, but then also working really hard not to take lots of time from the community, because time is our most precious resource. The other thing that I would add in terms of transparency is being really clear and upfront about the full commitment of the grant, the full commitment of all of the grant obligations. And so that includes information about how the money will come to grantees. Is it going to come up front? Is there some of it that is held back until the person or the group submits a final report? Does that mean that they're having to pay money up front and get reimbursed, or is there the possibility that all of the money can come before they have to start paying it out? It also means understanding how involved the reporting process is, and making sure that people can check out the final reports, the interim reports, if you have those, and look at what those are going to involve before they start the application process. I think that can also help people to know what they're getting themselves into. For us, we're dispersing federal funds, which means that our funds come with pretty hefty strings attached. And so that's a huge part of the transparency for us. There are times where, you know, a prospective grantee, a grant applicant really wants a lot of support on the application side of the process. And it's important for them to know that, you know, there's a certain level of support we don't provide, because if you can't fulfill that up front, you're unlikely to be successful on the other side of the award. And we want to make sure that we're setting people up for success and not failure. And so that, I think, is another part of transparency. It's just being transparent about, you know, you see the application, but what is everything after the application? What is everything after you receive the award? And making sure people know what they're getting themselves into.
Thanks, Megan. I had 2 follow-up questions on those, unless someone in the group wanted to directly follow up on this question or anything that you've heard with these folks.
I'll just add, I was just thinking, we were saying, encouraging people not to be shy about asking questions. And believe me, lots of other people are not shy. so don't, I'll get a text, you know, demanding what happened on this, you know, so I think people should feel free to call. We expect it. It's not always super fun, but if you're, you know, we try to be clear about why decisions are made, or at least we can talk about what the factors were, the number of applications, the number of other funders, or, you know, the demonstration of community support. But we're ready for it. So so don't be shy.
Not fun is the right. Cynthia, you have your hand up.
Yes. The Golden Heart Community Foundation in Fairbanks is, you know, relatively new compared to like ACF or the Rasmussen Foundation. And we have very limited funds that we can give out as grants. You know, right now we're just a little over 30,000 a year. Fortunately, in the past, we've had limited number of applications, and only 1 or 2 have been turned down, and they're usually for very specific reasons, like they're outside the Fairbanks North Star Borough, or they don't meet the nonprofit. But now we're starting to get more and more applications. And I know, I think it was Alex who says they like to make everything a yes if they could work with the person who's asking. But how do you limit, or how do you have to, when you have to limit the number of yeses you give, how do you do it equitably?
Let any of you, Alex or Matt or Megan, answer that. I'm on pins and needles. I'd like to hear the answer too.
I could
And
take
a second part to that is it better to give lots of small grants or a few bigger grants, but then you touch less people?
Yeah,
less
good question, Cynthia. That's too good. Matt, you want to take
Yeah,
a stab?
I'll try. The yeses feel better, right? Like you feel good when you're able to say yes, and the no's are the ones that you kind of keep you up at night, and you know, you spend a lot of time thinking, okay, what did I handle that the right way? So for me, we end up getting a lot of smaller grants. Ours are south of 5,000. We're not, if we're getting a request for 5,000 or more, for me, anything above 10,000 goes to my board. So it kind of takes, I'm clear usually. But it's, again, the equity is a big deal for us, because our primary focus area is in Southeast Alaska in our traditional communities. So we look at the 11 or 12 traditional communities, and we have the rubric. I think Megan mentioned the rubric. So we're really clear in terms of where we think the funding should go. We have data that shows, how much we've given to each community over the past 15 years. And so we try to fall back to that as much as possible. If we get questions saying, okay, you're giving too much to this community and not enough to this one, we have actual data that tells us how we're doing. And so for us, it's just, yes is our starting point too. That's kind of how I go into every one of them, knowing that in my mind, I try to put myself in the position of the person that's asking for the funding, knowing that they're super passionate about it. So how can I get to a yes? And oftentimes it's the money might not be the ask might not be right. So trying to get them, okay, what do you really need? And asking them, how much are you willing to share with me your budget for this? And some of this stuff, the requests that I get, it's for helping a band. Like I just recently gave some funding to Cloak for to help with some arts and art festival. And they weren't asking for a lot, but the more that I looked at it, we ended up giving them a little bit less than they asked for it, and they were just over the moon happy. So I think for part of it's just a kind of give and take with them to find out how much they actually really need, because sometimes they do. I mean, you guys are used to this. They come in and they ask, they want everything, and you really are only able to give them maybe a quarter of what they're asking for.
I can speak a little bit to this as well, just because I think we're in a somewhat similar position to you all, in the sense that we have a really varied amount of funding that we give out year to year. There have been years where we've given out well upwards of $500,000, but there have been other years where we've given out $50,000. And we're statewide, we serve organizations statewide. And so trying to figure out how to balance the amount of interest and need and projects that we could fund versus the actual availability of funding is something that we're grappling with all the time. And I think that one of the things that comes up is you're either narrowing your criteria up front so that people recognize that they're ineligible for the funding up front, or you're doing that on the back end. And when you have a limited pool of funding. And for me, it is kinder to the community to have a narrower pool of, or a narrower definition of what kinds of projects or what kinds of organizations you're able to support, than to have tons and tons of applications where people have spent lots of time and energy and emotional investment in those applications, but then find out on the back end that they're not going to get funded. I do think that there's still lots and lots of interest and room for smaller funding amounts. And so I do, I on balance would say, more projects, funding more projects at a smaller amount is probably beneficial to the community. That being said, you have to also balance your own time because managing lots of active grant projects is a lot more time for you than managing a smaller number. And so you have to be careful when deciding how many projects you're able to fund, about how many you're going to be able to manage long term, how many relationships you're going to be able to keep on going. And so, I think that it can be, people get sad when they narrow a grant opportunity in terms of the available funding, because they think of all of the things that are just not even, things that they're going to hear about anymore. Oh, there was such a cool project like this and they're not going to be eligible, and there's such a cool project over here and they're not going to be eligible. But the fact is, when you have a small pool of funding, lots of people aren't going to get funded. And so are you telling them upfront, or are you telling them on the back end after they've already put a lot of energy into the application? The only other thing I'd add to that is that the other consideration in terms of equity is you want to be receiving applications for work that people would do no matter what. You don't want people having to develop projects that are specific to your grant opportunity. And so if you are narrowing the competition down, you want to be really careful that you're narrowing it in a way where this is work that is happening in your community, that needs funding, and that nobody's going to be designing new projects just to fit your opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with all that was said already. Some things that we look at, and regardless of the size of what we have to give out each year, the demand is greater than what we can give out. Our tier twos have doubled. I was thinking maybe it was just last June during a board meeting, it was double the year before. I thought, well, it's just coming out of COVID, but then it was still double in November, and then it's doubled. Anyway, so I think there are just there's more demand and need. So some of the things that we think about and we are talking about is, what difference will we make? So in the project, if we're not there, will the project still go forward? Before we've looked pretty, neutrally about projects. They fit the criteria. They've got community buy-in. They've got a good plan. It fits our, we're primarily a capital funder, and they've got a good funding stack. Goes forward. If we are more limited on funds, we might lower the amounts, but we just want to, what difference will we make? Is it a big giant project and we're just kind of an add-on, and they probably can get funding from somewhere else? But that takes more work. I think on the funding side, there are other things that can be done. And this was also something that, we experienced. I had several of us were working with ACF on the CARES Act, CNRF, and then the ARPA funds, and, various funds. And you have to look at what other funding do they have, or are there other funders or other funding opportunities? I emailed Eleanor about one today that doesn't fit our criteria, or maybe it was yesterday, and said, is there any, ARPA money or COVID, response money left somewhere? And sometimes we call. I think that for the affiliates, you should also look at, we're a capital funder. And if there's a capital piece to what there is, call us. Just say, does this seem like it would fit a tier one? It doesn't have to be $25,000. It could be 5, it could be 8, it could be, and so that's what we're trying to do. But there's a capacity issue, I know, for the affiliates. Another thing that we're doing is reaching out to other funders beyond.
Alex, can I ask you a question about the calling Rasmussen?
Yeah.
Who do you like them to call? Many of the affiliates on the phone know Jeff quite well, but you obviously are the VP of Program Grants. Who would you direct them to call? Because I think they will probably call you. There's a lot of the program projects are starting to have an operational and a capital component.
The best thing to do is really just call the office. So the way it works, and it'll feel very impersonal. You can always email me. It's just that you might not hear back very quickly, and not because I don't care. There's just such a volume. But we have a process right now, and in addition to the online tool that we'll launch, but that won't be for until the end of the year. Really leave a message at the front desk. Say what it is. We have an intake log, and we assign program staff to respond to calls, and they go straight. And there are 3 people that vet it and say who should respond here. So that's the best way. Anyone can answer that question. It doesn't have to be anyone that knows about the affiliates. Everyone on the program team understands our tier ones. And usually they're pretty simple. It's like, it's a roof project, it's furnishings, it's, office equipment, and they'll be able to answer, that's going to fit. the price seems reasonable, or, they'll kind of give you some guidance and then encourage you to have the grantee apply. It's possible, and it's a capacity issue on our side. Sometimes we're able to work with you to accept kind of the application you have and make it work. But that takes a little extra. We could take the proposal, then ask the grantee, would you please fill out a cover sheet, but in our system, and then we'll try to do it. And we will try that. I just don't know if we always can, but definitely ask us. If we don't have the capacity, we'll tell you, but it's not a crazy thing to ask. But I would imagine a lot of things that you are funding, there are capital pieces, and that it might not occur to you to ask us. And we vet, we don't advertise this, but we vet tier ones every other month. And that's about when they're come in on a rolling basis. We cut a line at some point, and then we vet them. So there isn't a huge wait time on those. It's not going to be fast either. It's hard for us to do one 1 month, but within 2 months we can pretty much process. But still, I think that there is an issue with prioritizing. And you may need to, once you receive them all, just make a judgment call, and you're just going to have to prioritize and then be able to communicate out to the community how you prioritized. We had an overwhelming selection, because it's COVID and families are having challenges. We ended up prioritizing, things that help parents get to work, or, I don't know, just making it up. But, and then I think just communicating it.
And this triggers a good question. I was going to get back to you all's advice. It seems like developing and establishing criteria that are clear and transparent up front is essential to good strategic grant making. And if there's specific advice that you could give the affiliates on ways to do that, given your experience, on ways they can work with their boards. I know a number of the affiliates do it by theme sometimes, but if there's any particular advice you have on kicking the process off with clear, transparent criteria that will set them up for success, that would be great to hear. And then, and I'll ask that first, and then I have another follow-up. Matt, how do you develop your criteria?
How do we develop our criteria? That's a really good question. I could share with you guys what we did, the part of the exercise that we went through. First of all, what we did is we looked at where we were giving our money, like organically over the last 15 years. Where were we actually giving our money? And then we tried, because there were some long-standing, institutional decisions that were made. Like we were giving money to basketball camps, and we were giving a lot of what we were doing and what we do in Southeast is sports and its activities. And so when we looked through our criteria, we didn't want to totally change it. And, because you can't give all your, I'm a sports guy, so I shouldn't even be saying this. Nina and I serve on the Alaska Sports Hall of Fame, so I shouldn't be saying this, but you can't give all your money to sports, right? You have to spread it around. You have to make sure that there's other organizations that are benefiting. And so when we went through it, we knew we needed to keep sports in there. So one of the in our guidelines, it's physical, social, and economic health. So it's it fits within that. And the other three that we giving areas are cultural practices, environmental guardianship, and generational work. And so the generational work is sort of broad as well. For me, when I went through that, I didn't want to limit myself. And so kind of going back to what Megan was saying, I wanted to give myself a little bit of latitude. So when we do get these one-off requests, that there was some bucket that I could fit them in. And so having the latitude, and again, it goes back to, my personality, I want to be able to say yes. I want to try to find a solution. And typically when we're not able to, I always have in the back of my mind, all right, what other organizations would they go to? Or, can they go to one of your organizations? Can they go to the Juneau Community Foundation? Could they go through Tlingit and Haida? There's a number of other places for them to go to. Another thing that I think has really changed I remember when I worked at BP, I don't know if you guys remember Karen Cowart and Tamara Leinhart. They used to go and meet downstairs with every person that called them, and they would sit down with them for coffee. Obviously, we don't do that anymore. Everything's either virtual or it's email, and so the personal touch is sort of gone. And so trying to replace that and trying to make sure that when I get an email that I follow up with a phone call or I have some sort of connection with them. I think that's That's not necessarily tied to the criteria, but it's something that I try to do. And it is a little time consuming, but I think it helps. It helps to better understand what their request is, really understand what their project is.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Any other advice, Megan or Alex, on development of criteria, if that's what's going to set people up for success on equitable, transparent? Alex?
I think, and I think it'd be easier. What I would love to do, but it's hard when you're talking about the whole state, is I would actually recommend you consider doing a general survey of the community or of the nonprofits if you could, and just say, what are you seeing? What do you see as the needs? And something like that. And then when you can report back to the community in some kind of email saying, here's what we've heard. We're hoping to see requests in these areas. And then that kind of forecasts it. Your criteria can still stay the same because you might not get a lot of requests in the areas that people said there were needs, but then it's not a surprise if you're prioritizing and you have that to lean back on. I don't know how to do that for us at this point. And we're having some ideas about how to get input other ways, but that would just be like a very kind of tactic that you might want to consider.
Good idea.
I love that. And I guess just to get a lot more technical with it, I think that there are two ways that people approach rubrics. One is to actually do a formal scoring process, and another is a lot looser than that. And the way that we do it is that we do a formal scoring process, but we don't use that as a way of, like, we don't add up the scores and make a decision purely based on that. We use that to identify which grants have broad approval across the board, or which applications have broad approval across the board, which ones are broadly seen as not up to snuff, and then which ones are controversial. And so then we can focus the conversation on the controversial ones, and maybe there's something that one selector has seen but the other ones missed in the application, or maybe they have a little bit of background information that's useful to share. It also gives us the opportunity to look at the overall pool of applications and to think about, oh, there's two grant applications that are really similar projects, and maybe we should, or really similar organizations, and maybe we should choose one of them so that we can try to have a little bit more variety in the kinds of projects that we're funding. That's the kind of thing that we look at when we're using our rubric. And I think that clarity about how you use the rubric is another part of that transparency. So is it just a scoring process where at the end of it, the highest scored projects are all going to get funding and anything below a certain threshold isn't? There are good reasons to do it that way, particularly if you're worried about everything. Like if there's any concerns about things being above board, if there's a lot of politics, perceived politics in the situation, that can really help to make sure that there's a strong sense that this is a really sharp and precise process. But if you have a lot of trust within the community and you're able to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more agile, then I think that it's just about being transparent around that.
Thanks, Megan. Something that you and Alex both just said, and Matt as well, raises one of the challenges we all have as grant makers, ACF, Rasmussen, everybody. We're all human. We all have subjective opinions, and we all have bias, whether we think we do or we don't. And so as you're going through your process for awards and decision-making or creating committees, what are your recommendations for the affiliates on how to comfortably recognize and work through as a committee when you're awarding grants, how to address inherent bias in a way that's solution oriented and thoughtful?
One thing that I'll say, and it's always, you know, and it's not going to prevent all bias, obviously. We purposefully recruit a fairly diverse group of people to be on our review, you know, so as in terms of our program team. And we actually calibrate across. So at one time, program officers, you know, just our history, would kind of work, you know, on their grant and then come forward with a recommendation. And then we would we have something called peer review where we kind of poke holes in everybody's stuff. It's turned into a more positive experience over time. But what we try to do is to come up with our initial recommendations, and then we meet as a group and we talk about it. And that's really just to calibrate. And then you ask the question, you're like, I don't have an answer for that. You know, why this and why not that? And why this much over here and why not that? And so we pressure test it at multiple levels. You know, we do it with our direct supervisor, we do it across the team. We then do it with our CEO. Then anything over 500,000, we do with our CEO and our board chair. Those go to grants committee, same thing happens, and then at the board. And I think if you have enough perspectives in the room, that can help you, you know, but there's still who's in the room, you know, and so you have to kind of do both, but just to be open, not to accept something because somebody did it and it looks fine, like, you know, really be open to challenging each other and asking those hard questions about why this and why not that.
Dave, I see your hand up. Did you have a question about or some input into what Alex just said, which was very helpful, Alex? Thank you. It's some good ideas.
Well, I was just going to comment on Cynthia's original question. That was probably like about a half an hour ago.
Yeah. Sorry if I missed your hand. I can't see everybody.
Basically, because she was saying, how do we structure, do you do a few little grants, a few large grants, a few small grants, whatever. And I was just going to share what Seward does, because we have, we're real fortunate in that we've got a little bit of history behind us, and we're pretty pervasive in the community in Seward right now. So everybody kind of knows who we are and what we do. And so what we've developed is two different programs. So we have one major grant deadline every year, and we allow folks to apply for a major grant, which we consider about more than $5,000. And then we do monthly mini grants. And every year, at the beginning of our fiscal year, once ACF tells us what our grantable dollars are going to be, we'll separate out those two funds, basically amounts, those two pots of money in between the mini grants and the major grants, so that we know before we start the year how much we're going to have to give for major grants and how much we're going to give for mini grants. And then it helps us think about that strategically throughout the whole year, because we want to be able to give mini grants in January, we want to be able to give mini grants in December. And so it's been a challenge with making sure that those funds stay around for the whole year. And the challenge that we've just recently kind of found is when talking about criteria, the criteria that we use from the ACF grant evaluation form that we do on each one of our major and mini grants. The questions that we're using to evaluate those grants, what we found is now the grant applications do not ask the questions in a way that lead our grantees to answer those questions in the application. And so over the next year, that's kind of one of my major goals, is to rewrite our questions so that we're gleaning the right information from our funders. And that's really been the biggest challenge with us, is we want to see certain things from our grantees. Namely, we want to see a shared cost concept, where we don't want to see a group coming to us for 100% of every program that they do. We want to see them partnering with Rasmussen and other groups locally, as well as sharing costs among participants. But we don't have that in our application. So that's been a big challenge for us that we're working on changing. So I think having a criteria is only half of it, because we need to make sure that the folks that are applying for the grants know that criteria and can answer the grants, so that in a way that we can honestly review them.
Good
Eleanor,
point, Dave. Go ahead, Nina.
I have a question for the grantees and any of the actually affiliates as well. I think the one thing that the pandemic has taught us in a road that we may have already been going down is that as grant makers, we need to be more agile, flexible, and able to make decisions in a more quick and maybe less, planned fashion. And I guess there was a lot of good learnings from that, but from each of your organizations or each of the affiliates' point of view, what are the lessons that we learned during that you would really encourage us to take with us to continue to remind ourselves of the way that we step forward through this pandemic in our grant making?
Who's got the answer?
I don't really have an answer. I kind of go back to like, don't lose the personal touch, right? I mean, I think that's one of the concerns that I have, is that not when this digital age, and especially with the pandemic, that we just, everything is an email, and you're responding to an email, and you kind of lose that personal touch. To me, the relationship building and what we do is just extremely important. And so if there's one thing that it did, that I've kind of tried to go back to, is just that the idea of making sure you have a personal connection, that you understand, you ask informed questions about what their, what their project is, or what their funding, what other funding sources they have. That to me was the biggest takeaway over the past couple of years, just not losing that personal touch.
Good point. Others who want to respond to Dave or Nina, and then I want to get back to the bias, because I think that's a really important. I know a number of affiliates have been asking questions around what the good ideas Alex kicked off, but in response to Dave or Nina or Matt, I can't see everyone's hand, so please don't be shy in case I missed something. Carmen or Mariko, let me know.
One thing that gets back to, I can't even remember who said the question. Actually, I think it was Cynthia, about the large, like, do you do a lot of little grants? And this is sort of a tangent, but about how we could work together. It will make a difference on a Rasmussen grant if the affiliate is supporting it, 100%. That's like one way of showing that somebody on the ground in the community is saying this is important. Also, because we know your funds are limited. So when you select an organization, that's going to be a plus. And so I just wanted to make that clear. Also, I think, and the question is now asked, what does the affiliate say? Have you heard from the affiliate? And we don't have a mechanism where we actually talk with you very often. And so I think that, I'm probably going to encourage my program officers, and maybe we can set up some separate meetings. But for when we have a bunch of, requests from Fairbanks, do I call Golden Heart? We should. And so it's just something that sometimes we do, and some program officers do because they know people. But that's something I think we need to get more relationship, more of a relationship together. And it also applies to what's the lessons learned from the pandemic. And it was just how much more often now we're talking. I'll call the mental health trust more. I had the program officers present to my program officers. We just need to talk more. And even though we're in the same space, we don't coordinate our funding. It's really ad hoc, and that makes it hard for grantees. They don't know all these funding streams. They don't know all the timing. They don't know, and why should they? But anyway, so those are some thoughts.
The only thing I would add is that if you have a regular rhythm of giving out grants on a semi-frequent basis, so whether it's monthly, as David was suggesting, or quarterly, you're more prepared to turn something around quickly in response to a need that emerges in the community. If you're like pulling together everything to launch a grants process once a year, it's going to be a lot harder to be responsive than if you've got a regular rhythm going. And so if that's a goal for you, that you want to be able to be responsive and flexible to your community's needs, if that feels like something that you want to be doing, I would really recommend looking into a more frequent giving rhythm.
One thing just to build off Alex's last point around bias a few moments ago, we recognize that as affiliates, you have intimate knowledge of your community. So you are going to be an expert in the nonprofits and grant making, but that also puts additional pressure on when you say no, right? And how you say no, because you're also in a community where you know everyone. And so any ideas from our philanthropic leaders on, we started down the path of how do you, Alex talked about the diversity of your review panel with expertise. As statewide organizations, we have it a little bit easier because we can do conflict of interest forms for everyone who's on our committee. In a small community, you're always going to have a conflict of interest, right? You're always going to know someone that knows someone. And so if anyone in the group wants to share their perspective on how they create a review panel or in your boards to make sure that it's transparent, there's no bias, or ways that we can help you brainstorm. I think it's a harder job for you all than it is for us in these larger organizations. And maybe not. But that's what I've been hearing from people. And so any recommendations on how to address that for your committees, ideas from each other or from the panel. Oh, Mark, you have your hand up. Great.
Not so much to direct what your question just was, Eleanor, but to build on what Dave said about Seward. There was a question about, do we have an application process for our monthly mini grants? And we do. It's similar to the major grant, only not quite as thorough, I guess. Also, the mini grants we put a limit on those of $1,000, and it's a monthly event, so that pretty much at every board meeting that we have, it's set up that the grants committee will look at these, and the whole board will discuss the mini grants at the meeting, and that way we can answer them in a pretty quick way.
Thanks, Mark. Matt?
Eleanor, yeah, I'll attempt to answer that. And I'm actually really curious on what others, how others try to eliminate the bias. So from my perspective, we have a fairly active board, our See Alaska board. It's a 13-member board. A lot of the funding criteria above 5,000 is reported to them. And so I have, over the past couple of years, have been able to refine our reporting process. And so it's a pretty standard slide deck that they're used to seeing. And it has giving by area, so geographic area. So again, it goes back to equity. We want to make sure that each community is receiving adequate funding. And then we have the giving by type, and that again tells us whether we're kind of leaning too much on sports, or if we're not doing enough in arts and science. And so to me, I try to rely on that as much as possible when I'm getting those tough questions from our board, or, why are we not giving to this community, and really falling back on the data as much as possible. But it's almost impossible in my area in what I do to eliminate bias, right? When you're talking about people, our board members have community ties. They're connected with different organizations. Some of them might serve on a nonprofit that's asking for funding, and so as much as possible, just relying on the data that we have and the report that I generate every quarter. That's what I do. But I'm curious on what others do, because at the end of the day, we're human. We're making these decisions, and Alex mentioned having pressure testing and having a really diverse group of people that are involved. That we don't have it to that degree, but we have something similar like that. Just making sure that we got a lot of different perspective in the room when we're making these decisions, especially when it's above the $5,000 threshold.
Thanks, Matt. Other thoughts from the group to share? Dave?
I was just going to say, like everybody here, the reason we're all in this is to share our resources and to get our money out to the different groups in the community that are asking for it. And so the whole idea of getting to yes is kind of one of our main goals. And so what we try to do whenever we do wind up declining funding something, we try to have a good conversation with the person who's applying for the grant and give them some direction about what they can do to change it. Sometimes it could be something that's just a small tweak, sometimes it's not. But I also want to point out that sometimes those conversations are either misinterpreted or, especially, all of us are small towns, and I'll share, we had one example of a grantee that had applied for something that essentially involved what was going to become an advertisement for an ice cream store. And so one of our pretty firm guidelines is we're not going to support advertising for a private business. And so when we explained that to the company or the group applying for the grant, it was like, well, we kind of like the idea, but here you have this picture of a business and there's a competing business in town. Did you ask them and things like that? It kind of went south for a while, and even ACF got involved. But just know that sometimes there are road bumps. I guess I would point out as well.
No, it's a great point, Dave. I think most of us are aware there's inherent perceived or real power dynamic, right, in philanthropy, and it's kind of the buzzword across the country right now of that you all are very cognizant of. We all are do our best to avoid it, but there's always a perceived power differential when you're the decider.
No good deed is left unpunished.
I will add,
please, Alex.
We're talking about really subtle bias, and sometimes the bias isn't clearly about race, gender, religion, but it's not that hard to hear when it's personal. When you hear somebody say, it just doesn't sound right. It's like, she's so difficult to work with. Frankly, that's reality, right? Like sometimes working with people. So I will assign different things to different people sometimes because of bad experiences in the past. But, it's like, that's not a criteria. You don't have to like any of them. I don't even have to like any of you. Like we just have to be able to work together and respect each other. But I think that it actually comes out because people are like, I can't put my finger on it. It just doesn't feel right. Doesn't seem solid. And those are all subjective words, and they come out. And
that's a great point.
Whatever it could be. We're from different parts of the country, but somehow it comes out anyway. So I would just listen for that and say, that's not a criteria.
I'll just add real quickly. I'm dealing with something like that right now in the moment where I have to separate myself because we had an ask a few months back, and we unfortunately said no, and it was a huge ask. I mean, they were asking for 175,000, which is almost a third of what we give out on an annual basis, and we've said no, and we went back and forth with this individual and weren't able to find, there was no solution, and they did not like hearing no, and we didn't like saying no. So then they're coming back. This individual is coming back now, and right now, like I'm responding to emails today, asking for something else, and so I had to. He the way he reacted the first time, I didn't like it, right? Like personally, I was like, wow, that was really, I would not see that coming. And so now I'm trying to separate myself from it because I was, I don't want to be unfair to him. So I'm trying to get somebody else involved to at least have a chance to take a look at his proposal. And because I don't want to bring that bias into my decision making, right? So I totally appreciate where you're coming from, Alex.
Because we're people.
Yeah, it's so honest and real, both of you all. Thank you. It happens to us as well. I could see Katie laughing of like, maybe I'm just gonna not take this personally. I'm gonna pass it off to her. I think someone else. Oh, Cynthia, I see your hand. Oh, and Michelle, you're after Cynthia.
Sometimes in nonprofits, there are nonprofits with paid staff. There are nonprofits that are all volunteer, and sometimes a mix. So sometimes there are nonprofits that have great application writers. They can write an application for a grant really well, and then others not so much. So I was looking at who we've given grants to, and there's one and a couple others that we've given, 5 or 6 grants over the 12 years that we've been giving out grants to, because one, they're good grant application writers, and two, kind of, they have, you know, one's food and hunger and, you know, those things. But do any of the other affiliates or our funders that we're talking with limit how many times a particular nonprofit can get a grant, or like once every 3 years or once every other year or something like that? Does anybody do that where they limit the number of times a nonprofit can get a grant?
This is Michelle. Cynthia, you exactly asked my question, and we have very little money to give out, and we find the organization Swiss staff with grant writers that we have awarded to 2 different organizations 2 years in a row. And we just decided that we needed to put on our set of criteria that if you received a grant last year, you can't receive a grant this year. And I don't know if we nailed it down, but that was my question. And we do want to hold grant writing workshops or something along that lines. But most of these people are working full-time jobs. They're volunteers. They may or may not have time to write a grant. So they may or may not even see our grant application or criteria, but they're just kind of, a lot of them just throw up their hands at the thought of writing a grant. And yet I know they would easily qualify for our grants. So we need somehow to figure out how to bridge that gap in our community between these nonprofits that are doing extraordinarily amazing, wonderful things, but are already stretched to their limits, don't even know there's a grant, and don't know how to write a grant. Thank you.
Chris, you want to tackle that one?
I actually wanted to talk about what happens when you have an applicant year after year who has a great program going. And I know I'm not on the Petersburg affiliate board, but I do live in the community, and we had a fantastic project from the Salvation Army to do a kids backpack program so that kids could be sent home with food on the weekends, because we knew they were getting food supplements at school during the school week, but not necessarily on the weekends. And so, I mean, what an awesome applicant this was. And it was funded a couple of times in a row. And it needs to always be funded. But, you know, one of the things they did is, and if someone's on from the Petersburg board, they could speak to it better than I, but I was personally interested in it and said, I'm going to make sure this gets funded so that you guys don't feel like you have the limited funds at the community foundation always going to this. I think we can find it in other places. And I think that's a role that the affiliates can serve, is when they see these strong applicants, is to help them find other means of being funded, so that as an affiliate, you can continue to try to spread your good work around your community and not have one group dependent on it every year.
Great point, Chris. Thank you. And I see Kim's hand up.
Before we talk to Kim, could I address the question that was asked? Because I don't think that we've had a chance to. Just one thought, apart from limiting the number of times in a row that a applicant, or the number of times within a certain period of years that applicants can receive funding. Another option that gives a lot of flexibility is to ask a couple of questions like, have you received funding from the community foundation within the last 10 years or within the last X number of years? And then, have you received any funding, any grant funding at all in your organization's history? And we, as part of our rubric criteria, made it a priority to fund organizations who were first time with us, and also who were first time recipients of grant funding, generally speaking. And so that could become part of your process. And it doesn't mean that people who've received funding can't apply, but it does give an advantage to those who might have less sophistication with grant writers and that sort of thing. Another option is to create sort of separate pools of funding and have a small pool of funding that is specifically dedicated to organizations that are working with volunteers, writing their grants, and make that really clear so that they know that they're not in competition with professional grant writers.
Thanks, Megan. Good additions. Kim, and then I think Grace, maybe you went off mute. We'll go start with Kim and then.
Okay. Every January, the Seward Community Foundation has a nonprofit gathering so that we can announce how much we have available in grant money for that year. And one of the components of that meeting is we usually have a grant writing session, question answers, and to help our nonprofits, especially those that don't have grant writers on their staff and don't have staff, go through our grant application with them, answer questions, let them know the types of things that we are looking for, and help them, write a better grant so that we can provide money to their organization. And we've also numerous times held grant writing workshops in the community that are open to everybody.
Helpful, Kim. Thank you. Grace, were you going to chime in there? I think you're off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in Sitka, since we're all Sitkans, we know the organizations that are doing the good work. And even though it's a very poorly written grant, we say, we can help them with grant writing, but we still fund them. And then we spend some time with them and helping them work with it. And to me, that's the beauty of having your review committee all be from the community, because then we know the grants, we know the people, and we know they don't have the slick grant writers, but we want to fund them. And then we work with them.
Grace, do you have perspective on how you say no when you're that intimate with the community and you don't have the funds or you're not able to? Do you all have experience that you could share with other affiliates?
Well, Robin's had to say the no, we didn't. So,
so you make your program manager.
But she did it very well, and always, because I had friends that had received no's, and there weren't hard feelings, and it was always a way of helping. Robin was always very good about helping the nonprofits get the skills they needed so that they could apply again the next time. So.
Thanks, Grace. I was going to ask one more question, but then open it up since we're starting to run out of time to you all. If there's anything while we had Alex and Matt and Megan here, anything else you wanted to ask them, but and this is maybe a big question that's going to be hard for them to answer, but how do you anticipate community need through strategic grant making, or is it possible? That's a heavy, high bar, but if you all have any input, the affiliates actually do quite well with that, but we can always generate new ideas. Anticipating community need. And it may be the affiliates are ahead of us all on that because they're on the ground, but.
I was going to say, I'll say a couple of things.
Sure,
one, I'm curious to the other affiliates, if this is what you experienced. We found it fairly strange in our major grant cycle, which is in the spring this year. For the first time, at least as long as I've been on the board, about 4 or 5 years, we had fewer grants requested than we had dollars to spend for our major grants this year. It's obviously not a problem. We just moved some extra money into our major grants. But what we think the reason for that is some of our larger nonprofits that normally are requesting big grants from the major drive at the beginning of the year, they were still trying to spend down some CARES Act and some ARPA money and things like that. I'm curious if other groups, other affiliates had the same eye-opening this year.
Cynthia, were you going to say something, or are you? Debbie?
Hi, sorry I can't have video right now, but I'm in Palmer, and I wanted to say, and it kind of is about what I put in chat earlier about how we handle repeat requests because we don't fund operating costs. And we came to that decision as a result of a community gathering we had. We tried to find every nonprofit in our community. We came up with I don't even remember now, it's pretty huge, 30 or 50 in the immediate Palmer area. And this was a few years back, invited them all to a lunch where we did some little conversations about what community foundations are, what we wanted to be, and then did some exercises in asking them what they saw as the needs of the community and the priorities of the community. And then we used those to set some of our goals. And one of and we've said that we want to do it again, pandemic got in the way, and do it regularly, was that they felt we have enough organizations that fund an ongoing need. Little League needs uniforms, that food bank, that just constant ongoing charitable needs. They liked the idea that we were looking at more permanent, even infrastructure or things that would last and make a change in our community. And so it has really shaped our goals. And that meeting was really productive because it was with the nonprofits. I guess you could invite anyone, but we invited the heads of all our local nonprofits.
Debbie. Well, are there other, from the affiliates where we still have Alex and Matt and Megan here, are there other challenges or opportunities or that you'd love to discuss with them and brainstorm with each other related to strategic grant making before we wind down and take a break before the 2 o'clock session? Liz?
Yeah, I was interested on the agenda, the question of recognizing and addressing bias during the grant making. Thoughts on that?
I guess I never spoke to that piece, and I'll share. I think that one of the pieces is really setting expectations up front that there is no way to remove bias from the process. Whenever there are humans making the selection, there's going to be bias involved. And so making sure that that is part of the discussion from the beginning is important. I also think that there's the opportunity to look at it in both ways and to express it beyond conflict of interest, because conflict of interests are going to have to be pretty extreme in small communities for them to be relevant to the grant making process. I think that part of what you might want to ask for is, what relationships do you have that are with the community foundation that we should know about, or what relationship with grantees and grantee projects, and not saying like this is a conflict of interest, but like let's just air them on the table so that we're all aware about them during the conversations that we're having for selection. And then another thing that I will just say from personal experience is I'm pretty strict that I want people to have, I give people lots of time to participate in the selection process. And I ask that everyone have reviewed every single grant in order to participate in the conversation. And I do this because in the past, there have been times where, I've had a selector who's only been able to review half or less, fewer of the grants. And then they get into the selection discussion and they start contributing to the conversation about a proposal that I know they did not review. And they start really swaying other members of the panel about that. And so I think transparency is important with your applicants, but I think that transparency with your selection committee is also really important. That, that participating in the selection committee is going to be about, this many hours of commitment, that, if you end up not being able to review all of the grants, then we ask that you not participate in the discussion, and so forth. For me, that made a huge difference in the way that the selection discussion was approached when I set those expectations with selectors.
It's a really great point. Go ahead, Alex.
One other thing I would say about bias, because we can all say, these are the applications we received, and not worry about why we didn't receive them from certain areas. And I think if you go into it just thinking we should expect grantees of all different backgrounds, populations being served of all different backgrounds, worthy of our grant making. And that if we're not hearing from them, or we're not receiving requests, then what can we do to increase the requests and to do some reach out? We had the opportunity just after George Floyd's murder to talk with our board about race, and it's not something that was just a common thing to bring up, and it probably wasn't in a lot of boardrooms. And it was one of the first times we proposed, and we did research, or the program team did, on are there any BIPOC-led organizations we haven't worked with, and there was all kinds of outreach, and they found it, and it wasn't systematic, but we just knew, and it was a surprising number actually that we had never worked with. So they did some due diligence, very cursory, and we gave operating grants with not with any, very little request from them, just to fill it out, kind of say what they're working on, and they were operating grants, which we don't do. But that started up relationships and led to some tier ones that came up later, and then actually some big tier twos. And so we knew it was on us, because the assumption is that we should have, equitable submissions, equitable, grant making, and we didn't. And so instead of sitting and wondering why, we're trying to do the outreach. It's limited though, and even who we know how to reach, is still limited. So anything you do, it's not going to be perfect or comprehensive, but every step in that direction, is helpful.
Thanks, Alex and Megan. They're both great points. I think one of the things, I can't remember who on the panel said it earlier, that it's also not just about race. Like, we all have inherent interests. So if you're on a selection committee and your goal is to have a diverse group of people, that it happens internally here. We have someone on our team who's really passionate about early education, and she's going to go in and she's going to read the 12 applications around early education. And my interest might be something else. And so really trying to step back across and have your committee be aware of what their passions are and their expertise, and bring in others on your team with that different expertise, in addition to race and all the other BIPOC issues, will be actually a fruitful conversation. You might learn quite a bit. I never knew so much about flag football until we had a donor here who was really passionate. And I thought, so it's getting out of your comfort zone and opening and listening to others' expertise.
I have one question for the panelists and for everybody. Traditionally, the Community Foundation and our affiliates, we have had a sort of fairly unwritten rule that we do not fund things that the grantee doesn't apply for, with the belief that it puts onus on to our belief of what they should be doing rather than what they want to do. But I think that in today's changing world where things are happening so quickly, I think that assumption maybe needs to be revisited in some way, shape, or form, and maybe an ability for grant makers like ourselves to think more broadly about casting an unrestricted amount that may be larger than they asked for or more broad than they asked for back at them. But I would love to hear your reflections on it. And specifically, I was thinking of a grantee who recently applied for a grant to serve the immigrant population here in Anchorage, in Alaska. One specific segment of it, and we actually ended up coming back and doubling the grant to them for broadening the immigrant population to include, Ukrainian refugees that may be happening 3 to 6 months when we're not going to have a grant cycle that's real and present and active. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about how we have to think differently about kind of the changing needs of the grant making world.
I don't know. I don't have anything sort of systematic to say about that, except that I think that's what we have to do. So we know, and I always say we have this young state in this ancient land, and we don't have a really strong philanthropic history and sector. And we don't have a really strong and deep bench in the nonprofit sector. So people are going to come with their projects. They might even second guess themselves and ask for less money. Or another comparable organization is going to ask for the world. I think we've seen that in the CARES Act and ARPA fund rounds. And so it's really, I feel like our job to say what seems right-sized, what fits. And it makes sense to me that, you would ask for more, because really, how would anybody know? They're not, a lot of people aren't going to do research and go, even if all our grants are available online, you'd have to sort, you'd have to know how to sort. Try to do some kind of analysis for what's the average request for this kind of a thing. And so I think being flexible is just part of the relationship, and then also educating people about what's possible without being too. You don't want to be controlling and tell them to do an entirely different project. But I think that's really important, and then that's where we're really trying to partner to get to the outcomes they're trying to get to. It's just we do it through them, by funding them.
Helpful, Alex. Thank you. Other thoughts on Nina's question or Alex's response and ideas? And if I don't see you, sorry, my screen on. I think I got most people. Well, if there's not any other burning last minute question, I just want to really thank Megan and Matt and Alex for taking the time. I know you're all crazy busy, but it's enormously helpful to have people with your experience and depth of knowledge from across the state. I'm really appreciative of the good questions from the panel. The affiliates have a unique skill set in grant making, so I think it was a nice complement between the state and smaller communities. But thank you so much for taking the time and for the thoughtful discussion, everybody. And if there's nothing else right now, we'll give everybody a little. Oops,
Eleanor, I'm sorry. There's a couple of questions that have come in, so I don't know if we have, but we want to take advantage of having them
Yeah,
on the
please
line.
do. I just want to make sure I gave people a break before 2 o'clock for lunch.
Yeah. So I guess I'll condense the 3 that have come in here a little bit. So could you advise us on how we approach talking about bias or approach building in transparent processes when half of our board thinks we have some work to do, and then the other half of the board or the grants committee thinks we have no issues at all, we're doing everything perfect. So do you have advice for folks on just how to approach that conversation, or how to start, how they can start? So transparent processes, addressing bias, acknowledging it.
Within your committee, right?
Within the grants committee, or when we're having decisions being made. How do we approach this if half the people think we're doing just fine and then half the other folks are concerned?
I guess I think that it really depends on how that dynamic is emerging. If no one is talking about it in front of one another, and you're just hearing about these concerns from individuals on behalf of the board that are concerned about it, then I think that part of the process is trying to build the confidence and willingness to bring that concern forward to the group, and to sort of make it visible that there is a disagreement among the board members about where they are as a group. And the more that it can be done in a way that is really about, this is a concern about all of us. I mean, bias is something that is universal. There is no one who, every single one of us is human. We're all subject to cognitive biases. We're all subject to the implicit biases of being surrounded by, all sorts of information that we're taking in all the time that affects how we perceive the world. And so I think that there's a way to frame those concerns where it's not like, oh, I think that those people on the board are a concern, but more, this is something that we all need to tackle and we can be in it together. If you don't have that as something that is a visible disagreement among board members, it's really hard to tackle. And so the first step might just be getting to the point where people are willing to bring that forward. It doesn't work very well when you come to people who aren't willing to bring it forward and you say, some people here are concerned about, and you have to have it be at a point where people are willing to talk about it. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's a really sticky, difficult situation. And I'm not sure that there's a perfect way to handle it. There's just kind of, I have a bit of a reputation at the forum where I say sometimes you have to invite the chaos in to get to the other side of it. And I think that this is an example where it's really scary because it's going to be sticky and messy and it's going to feel bad for a while. But you're never going to actually address it unless you face that stickiness and that messiness and a little bit of that chaos.
I'm going to say something that's probably not going to sound popular. And so
Please do.
I studied constitutional law and minority issues in law school, been on the ACLU national board. So civil rights and civil liberties is like really core to my whole career. And it's really interesting hearing people talk about how to take this on straight on. And this happened in the last foundation I was at. They really wanted to talk about race. Really, that foundation worked with foster care agencies. This is going to be way too long. Anyway, I'll try to make it much shorter. And so then all of the staff who are really experts in foster care wanted to do anti-racist training themselves and conduct it. And it's actually not a skill most people have. And so I think that people have to be very careful, I think, talking about it. But really, I think if you focus on your mission, and I'm not saying ignore it, I'm very aware of bias and look for it, and you can be that. But what is it we're trying to do? And some people would say the way I talk about it is code switching. I call it communicating. So with my board, we say diversity is an issue, is a value of ours. And we don't talk about anti-racism. We don't talk about diversity. The words don't matter. But if we want Alaska to work, so we're looking at the state and you're looking at your community, our most limited resource, I don't care what anybody says, is our people. And that's what makes this state. And that's my opinion. And if all people are not functioning and there aren't opportunities going over, we're not going to make it. And so that's how I talk about it. And I would just welcome you to look at what's happening in our community. We're not activating. The assumption is, if you really believe in equality, is that everyone should be doing well. And if they're not, who's not doing well? Let's fix it. You can get really caught up, I think, in the race conversation because it's so triggering. And it's something we're not good at talking about. And if you don't have professionals, I don't recommend it. So I mean, as far as an organization, I think one-on-one watch films, have training, but have professionals do it. I just think that it can create. So anyway, that's just like my absolute honest, frank opinion. But I think if you really focus on what's behind DEI, it's because we actually believe everyone is equal and that everyone should have equal opportunity. Where are there not equities? Because we want a strong, thriving community, whatever community yours is. And wherever there's a gap, maybe we should focus on that. And I think if you talk about that, everyone on your board agrees with that. I mean, I assume that's why they're on a community, you know, an affiliate board or whatever organization you're at. But I'm just hearing this conversation in a lot of places, and people, I feel it's getting in the way. So that's my little soapbox.
Well, I think it's very grounding to get back to you want everyone to do well. I mean, that's the goal of every affiliate. It's the goal of Alaska Community Foundation, the equity of people and all Alaskans, which is a heavy bar, which is a high bar, but it's a very grounding comment, Alex. So thank you. And if so, there's not any, I am cognizant of the time, and I want to make sure people get a chance to stand up and get some water. And so there's not any last minute comments. Again, I just want to thank everyone for their time and their participation. It was a really helpful conversation for the ACF team as well. Again, thanks to Alex and Matt and Megan, enormously appreciative of your time. I know you're all very, very busy. So yeah, unless there's anything else, I think we'll you can go off mute and stay on the Zoom, Carmen and Marco, until the 2 o'clock, return at 2. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Can I ask a question? If we go off, if we sign out, can we log back in? I don't want my battery to die just sitting here for 15 minutes. Can we log out and then come back?
Yes, Cynthia. Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks.